It was a terrible, deadly week again in Ukraine as Russian forces pushed into the heavily defended steel plant in the port city of Mariupol and sent missiles as far west as Lviv. With us on where things stand now, in London, UK, Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia at the Open Society Foundation. And in Washington, D.C., Rachel Rizzo, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
There's a lot of news happening right now, but I wanted to start with how the West's response has changed from the beginning in February to now. This is not the quick military exercise Putin had hoped for. Daniela, where do we stand at today?
Well, the Western response was, first of all, very quick, as early as February when Russia attacked Ukraine. The European Union and our transatlantic partners were quite well prepared. This was a big contrast to what happened when Russia attacked and annexed Crimea 8 years ago. And since then, we have seen a series of sanction packages. The latest one came through just this week, a proposal by the European Commission that actually includes also an embargo on oil. It includes more banks that should be taken off SWIFT, and that includes the largest retail bank, Sberbank. And then additionally, individuals that are sanctioned. So I think the EU has shown that in the area of sanctions, it is ready to go very far. Negotiations are ongoing, whether there need to be transition periods for single member states with regards to the oil exit, but it's a big move forward. And then on the military side, a number of European countries and of course the United States and others have delivered a lot of weapons. Germany in particular has really changed policy because usually Germany would not export weapons into conflict zones, and it has done. And it decided to do so only 2 days after the war started in February. And since then, the government has moved to also exporting or allowing the exports of heavy weapons, which is a political issue in Germany. But I think the signals are very clear that the European Union again, with NATO allies and other allies of the world, really wants to help Ukraine win this war that Russia is waging.
Rachel?
I would agree with everything that Daniela says. I think what has happened over the last couple of months since Russia began its invasion is not only unity between European allies and the United States, but increasing willingness to provide assistance and weapons as time has gone on that might have not been on the table at the beginning of this, say at the end of February or in March. And so we've seen multiple rounds of sanctions. We've seen the West send, ammunition and rifles and other types of weaponry that are increasing on the scale of toughness. I would say the United States is sending heavy weapons now, and so are some European countries. You're seeing, for example, in U.S. Congress, a supplemental spending bill of $44 billion for Ukraine. And so I think the West has shown immense unity, and that unity continues. I think the thing that worries me is that as this drags on, the longer that it goes on, I worry of that unity cracking in some way. But so far, I don't think we've seen that happen.
Well, speaking of how long this has gone on, Daniela, May 9th, this Monday, is a significant date. How come?
Well, it is a day on which Vladimir Putin would like to celebrate some kind of victory. 9th of May being the end of the war that Russia always celebrates as one of the countries that won the Second World War. And so there is a lot of anxiety at the moment that actually over the next few days that are left before Monday, that the war atrocities will increase, that there will be more bombardments and more attacks. So he can declare something. But indeed, the war will not end on that day. And, the initial expectation on the Russian side was definitely that this war could be short and quick. And so Russia could be declaring victory far more quickly than we now see. The perspectives are very bad, and that means that the war will very probably go on. And May 9th may be used by Vladimir Putin for a big speech in which he announces something, or he reframes the narrative of the war, which will then maybe mean more aggression, different ambitions than we know at the moment. And so I think that date has to be watched with a lot of caution. It also means something on the European side. Because in Europe, this is also an important day, which is usually a day where one thinks of the future of Europe, of celebrating peace on our continent, and the great achievements of decades of European integration. And on this particular May 9th, a conference on the future of Europe will hand over its results to the president of the European Commission and the Parliament, and also the actual EU presidency that France holds at the moment. And the French president will hold his first Europe speech since he got re-elected. And it will be very interesting to see what the ambition level is, because Europe obviously is under pressure by that war, and at the same time has a reason to exist that hasn't quite been as strong over the past years.
Well, as you speak of the anxiety leading up to Monday, this past week on Russian primetime TV, a news anchor said Britain could be annihilated by Russian nuclear strike, one by air and one by sea, creating a tsunami that would submerge the United Kingdom and Ireland. The threat of Russia using nuclear weapons, to what extent is that a real and clear present danger? I want to hear from both of you. I'll start with you, Rachel.
So this nuclear saber rattling is something that Putin has used not just during the war in Ukraine, but he uses it as a way to threaten the West into not doing things that he doesn't want them to do, such as enlarging NATO. I think Putin he's not suicidal. I think that he's largely a rational actor. If you look at the reasons that he's laid out for this invasion, it all makes sense in his mind, as crazy as it might look to an audience in the United States or Europe or Canada. But I think he understands that the use of nuclear weapons would be crossing a threshold that hasn't been crossed in decades, and it would mean a severe and swift response on behalf of the West towards Moscow. And I don't know that, and I don't think that that's a risk that he is willing to take. The thing that I do worry about is, as the Russian military weakens, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said just a couple weeks ago that the goal is to weaken Russia to a point that they can't do the certain things that they've been doing in Ukraine. If Putin feels like his military is weakened to a point that the only option he has is the use of a, say, small tactical nuclear weapon on a Ukrainian city, just as a warning to the West to not get even further involved, then I do think that's concerning. However, I do want to be clear that I think that scenario is still highly unlikely.
Daniela, Rachel mentioned that Putin is not suicidal, but there is maybe an occasion where if he does feel in a corner, something might happen. You're there geographically closer to this. What's the sense there? Are you concerned about this happening?
Of course, it is a concern, because it is, even if an unlikely scenario, it is a scenario. And I would say that much of the debate in Europe, particularly on arms deliveries, is always also seen in the context of, will that escalate the situation? Is there a risk that this would push him further to such a move? But at the same time, it is absolutely clear that Europe has to support Ukraine in this war. So at the end of the day, the decisions made, they are for a scenario where Russia can actually win this war in Ukraine. Um, on Putin's rationality, I think the lesson had to be learned the hard way by observers around the world, really, because when the troops build up on the eastern border of Ukraine, many said, well, it would be completely irrational for him to start fighting the war because he has so much to lose. And in military terms and economic terms, oil and gas imports to the European Union. And at the end of the day, his rationality was a different one. For him, it was the right thing to start that war and also to continue it when he realized that he wasn't getting as quickly as he wanted to where he wanted to be. And so I think today it is very hard to guess what his his calculus is and what his rationality at this stage in the war is. And again, I do think what he says on Monday has to be heard and interpreted very cautiously.
And Rachel, next to Russia and Ukraine, I think the largest population of Ukrainians is in Canada. So naturally, there's been Canadians going to defend Ukraine. And Russia is calling Canadians fighting in Ukraine mercenaries. Why does that terminology matter as opposed to calling them what they're being called here in Canada, foreign fighters?
Well, there's a difference between Canada or the United States or a European country officially sending troops under their own flag to help fight Russia on behalf of Ukraine. Mercenaries don't wear the flag of their country. They're going on a volunteer basis. But this is interesting because Russia is known for using mercenaries to help fight their wars overseas. The Wagner Group, for example, this sort of shadowy amalgamation of organizations that is run by an associate that's close to Vladimir Putin, has sent mercenaries to places like Syria and Libya and now Ukraine. There was a video that was released just yesterday of Wagner mercenaries doing close combat in a Ukrainian city. And so this isn't something that's just happening from the West. This is a style that has been used by Russia for a long time and continues to be used in Ukraine as well.
We've heard stories of people from Africa joining on the Russian side, but we have also heard a lot about non-Ukrainians going to defend Ukraine. Why do you think there's an interest from non-Ukrainians in foreign fighting in this war in particular? Rachel?
Well, I think that what we've seen over the last couple of months is a real hero story, right? I mean, Ukraine is a country that is much smaller than Russia, much militarily weaker, although it has put up a brave fight and has, I think, really surprised not just Russia, but the West in how it has stopped Russia from gaining territory in a way that we might thought it have been much quicker. So when we're watching this happen over the last couple of months, I think there's this sense of this David versus Goliath story, and people do want to help a country whose democracy has been thwarted and whose sovereignty has been attacked by its much larger neighbor. So it doesn't surprise me that people do feel called to help Ukraine in this war.
And Daniela, even though Russia's calling Canadians fighting in Ukraine mercenaries, Russia's used foreign fighters in other recent Russian conflicts. Can you tell us about those?
Yes, well, Russian fighters have also been sent to fight in Mali, for instance, called in by the government, it seems, and which was one of the reasons why France, who was also present, decided to actually withdraw. So it's a very contentious international issue that Russia uses these fighters in that way. And I think Ukraine is just another example on that list, and they are known for an extreme brutality. As war crimes are being investigated in Ukraine, obviously special attention will have to be paid to the question to what extent the Wagner Group and others have also been involved.
Is there any evidence that Russia is also using foreign fighters in Ukraine, or are they just using Russian soldiers, Daniela?
But that is hard to say from the outside, but there are reports which are not verified yet, to my knowledge, that they have been seen. And so the suspicion is that they have been withdrawn from other places and sent there, but this remains to be investigated.
Rachel, in 2008, Ukraine applied to become a member of NATO for the very reason of the situation we're in right now. Should Ukraine have been let into NATO when it wanted to?
Well, I think that's a topic that's being hotly debated today, but also has been debated for the last 13 years. Unfortunately, I think NATO put Ukraine and Georgia, remember, who wanted to join at the same time. NATO put them in probably the worst spot possible, which is we promised them that eventually they would join the alliance, that they would be protected by NATO's mutual defense clause, which really at the end of the day is why people want to be a part of NATO. But we didn't say when, we didn't give them a date. And so we just sort of left them hanging in limbo. And when you look at how Russia has responded to that over the last 13 years, it invaded Georgia in August of 2008. It illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, and it invaded Ukraine yet again in February of this year. And so I think that there's a lot of questions about what should have happened in 2008 and since then, if Georgia and Ukraine should have been allowed to join NATO. But at the end of the day, I think they were put in an almost impossible position.
And Daniela, you mentioned Germany kind of navigating its relationship with Russia. It's been described as painful. Why those words?
Germany had to fundamentally review its Russia policy. Over the past years, the government, despite the annexation of Crimea, still stuck to a policy which was called either Partnership for Modernization or change through trade. So the idea was that closer economic relations would actually help build a stable relationship and eventually might even open up and to some extent transform Russia. And this has obviously been proven wrong. Now, the problem is that Germany, with that policy, created a huge dependency on Russian oil and gas imports. And so today, reviewing this policy is so difficult because it cannot happen overnight that Germany says no to gas and oil imports. So a lot is happening since the beginning of the war in Ukraine to make Germany less dependent on, in particular, Russian gas imports, which have a huge share. But there's also more to that question from a German perspective. Russia is, of course, geographically very, very close to the European Union's eastern borders and to our eastern neighbors. And so the idea to have an ongoing conflictual relationship with Russia is something that worries many because of the stability of our continent. There is a saying in Germany, you cannot have peace and stability on the European continent against Russia. So obviously right now, there is no way to go back to the status quo ante. But the big question remains not only how the war and conflict in Ukraine can be settled, but also how, in particular, those countries neighboring Russia, whichever way the war settled, they have a situation where they can rely on the protection of their own sovereignty and their territory. Because, as Rachel said, Russia has been invading Europe's neighbors, 2008 Georgia, 2014 Crimea and Ukraine's east, and now again Ukraine with the threat to go into the Republic of Moldova and possibly other places. So this is the reality of the European continent today, and you know the European security order that was built after the end of the Cold War is basically shattered. So that question with regards to Russia is a fundamental one on European security.
And Rachel, with so much of the future uncertain, to what extent does Germany have to restructure its economy because it is a NATO and EU member and has to follow suit?
Well, I think Daniela made some really excellent points, and I would agree with all of them. I mean, this is not just Germany lessening its dependence on Russian oil or gas or playing a larger role as a great power in the European Union or on the European continent. This is a complete reorientation of how Germany sees itself as a global actor, and a complete reorientation of its economy. And I don't think this is something that happens overnight. This is Germany's had a lot of pressure placed on it by European countries and the United States. And I think it's responded in a way that is laudable, and it's impressive for such a quick turnaround. And I do think that there are serious conversations happening in Berlin in terms of what this means for Germany in the long run. And I do think that we should expect some serious changes going forward, but they might take a little bit longer than people are hoping.
And Daniela, the global world order is at stake, and the world is watching what's happening in Ukraine very closely. Can you see a time when the war in Ukraine may lead to other states using force to subsume neighboring countries?
There's a clear worry that China will study the case of this war now very closely and think through its strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan. Maybe the fact that Russia wasn't able to have the victory it wanted to have in Ukraine that quickly makes it less likely that China attacks Taiwan anytime close. But if you listen to China experts, they assume that this is actually something that might happen over the next few years, which is why it is so important that those countries who stand up against the war in Ukraine together with Ukraine make it very, very clear that they stand for the protection of principles of the international order, and that is national sovereignty, the protection of national territory, which are fundamental principles also of the UN Charter. And so we are right now at a moment in time where the war in Ukraine and the response to the war in Ukraine have a far bigger dimension and go beyond Europe. So this is really a big challenge for those states that stand with Ukraine to make clear that they stand in not only for a country, but really for principles of a peaceful international order.
And Rachel, we've seen those images of Putin either at a big, long table with advisors seated very far away from him. Is that a metaphor for Putin's physical distance or isolation compared to the rest of the world?
Well, I do think those images are quite striking when you look at Putin and the images that are released by Russian state media. The majority of the time, it's either him in a massive room with his advisors who are far away, or him at the end of one long table where his advisors are at the opposite end. And when you contrast those to the photos that come out of Ukraine with Zelensky huddling close with his advisors, it's just a stark difference. And so I do think there is sort of a metaphor there when you look at Putin's isolation and compare it to Russia's broader isolation on the world stage. I think we also have to remember that Putin has taken COVID to the extreme. He is and has been quite isolated over the last couple of years. Reports of the requirements that his closest advisors have to go through to even get in the same room as him are pretty extreme. And so I question, and I know other people question, how that has somewhat affected his mental state over the last couple of years, and perhaps how that has played into his recent decision making.
And Daniela, we have less than a minute left. Truth has been said to be the first casualty of war, and it's hard to decipher who's winning the invasion in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of information is flowing out from Ukraine through social media, and obviously there's also a lot of Russian propaganda out there. So we have to be very careful how to digest those news, and it is very important to scrutinize and identify fake news. But at the moment, I think we see that Ukraine is standing its ground thanks to a huge mobilization also of civil society in a way that is really unexpected. And that is also why the international support also of individuals, as we discussed, to go and decide for themselves to go and help with that fight, that mobilization is so important.
Daniela, Rachel, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We really do appreciate your insights into this complex issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.